Welcome to Fridays with a Forester. My name is Gary Wyatt, one of the hosts. This is March 17th, Climate Adaptation. So Lauren is also helping us with the hosting today's Zoom. Lauren Beckus is Andover Regional Support Staff. And my name is Gary Wyatt, again, Extension Educator with the University of Minnesota Extension based out of Mankato Regional Office. And today we have the presentation is on climate adaptation, and Jamie Mosel is our extension educator in climate resilience, part of our team in Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. She's on St. Paul campus and also in Andover, and she's a newly hired extension educator. And we welcome her today to the Fridays with the Forester. Thank you for joining us, Jamie. And you can share your screen, and I think I can stop sharing here, I think. Wait a minute. I've got a few other announcements. Excuse me. So participants will have the opportunities to chat and to voice or type in questions in the Q&A. So please do that. We usually try and end at 10 o'clock, but if we go over, that's fine. We are recording all these webinars on the Z-link, z.umn.edu/Fridays. Now, Jamie, you can stop. I'll stop sharing and you can start sharing. How about that?
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, welcome.
Share this one and full size. Is that looking good?
Yes, very good.
Perfect. Okay. Well, yeah, thank you, Gary and Lauren. I'm really especially grateful to Gary because it's a privilege to be here, and also he's been such a kind person in welcoming me to Extension. So today I'm going to talk about climate adaptation for Fridays with the Forester. As Gary mentioned, I'm Jamie. I recently started with the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership, and one of our goals with MCAP, that's what we call it for short, is supporting thriving communities and landscapes through collaboration, capacity building, and advancing climate-informed decision-making. And I always start all of my talks with just a moment for expressing gratitude, acknowledgement, and commitment. So where I am currently is in Minneapolis, the Twin Cities. So up here, we're on Dakota lands, but more broadly in Minnesota, we're on Dakota, Anishinaabe, and many other Native nations throughout time. And so I always like to acknowledge that past, present, and future, and that there's also responsibility to make sure we're including tribes and tribal concerns in climate action. This is a figure actually of the Twin Cities by Marlena Miles, showing Dakota culturally significant places throughout the cities. And so I encourage you to check those out. There's actually a couple more for like the southern Minnesota region. So if you check hers out, you can see more about that. And the topics that I'll be going over today, first, I'll just do a little intro of the University of Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership and some of the things that we do. Then I'll talk about climate change specific to Minnesota and climate projections for the future, and then some of the climate risks and adaptation, different things going on there, and then looking to the future. So again, MCAP's mission is to advance adaptation leadership, climate resilience actions, and cross-disciplinary collaborations to ensure that Minnesota is making needed progress to prepare for our changing climate. Some of the work that we're doing is here on this slide. That includes more recently the high resolution climate projections in the upper left there that will be coming out this spring pretty soon actually, and then we'll be doing some data trainings actually that folks can take to understand how to use those tools. This is our team. Our director Heidi Roop is up in the top left, and then there's me, actually a bit younger. And as Gary introduced me already, this is me. My background is in climate change and forest science, forest health, and actually a lot in tree physiology. And I went to St. Olaf College here in Minnesota. Then I went out to Oregon for my master's at Oregon State University, and I just finished up my PhD in January. So I'm relieved to have that done and out of the way. So now I'll talk about climate change in Minnesota. These are some of the things that we've observed and recorded already. The main takeaway as far as climate change here in Minnesota is that Minnesota is getting warmer and wetter. So the 10 wettest and warmest years on record, those have all occurred after 1997. There's been an observed 13% increase in the heaviest rainfall of the year. And then our growing season has lengthened by about 2 weeks since 1950. So overall, Minnesota's average annual temperature has increased by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s. So that's quite a bit of warming here. And then when we're talking about that warming, we can actually look over the year, average for the summer and average for the winter. So if we look on the left side of the screen, that's total temperature change between 1895 and 2019 in Minnesota. We can see even in our average of the entire year that northern Minnesota, that dark orange, has been warming more than the rest of the state, so northern latitudes. Then when we look at the summer, warming isn't as severe then, but when we compare to the average winter highs, that's pretty severe, especially in northern Minnesota. So the takeaway from that is that average temperatures, winter temperatures, are rising faster than the average for the entire year or for the summer here in Minnesota. And that has consequences for things like lake ice and for how much snow and how much ice we get during the winter. So Lake Superior ice coverage has reduced by about 50% over the last century. And this slide is showing on the left a satellite view of the Great Lakes during the winter interannual minimum for ice. So when there's been the least ice over the years, and a satellite view on the right during the interannual maximum. So when there's the most, and that minimum is what we're seeing a lot more of, a lot less ice coverage on our Great Lakes, especially in Lake Superior, compared to that interannual maximum that we're more accustomed to historically. And again, with those temperature changes, especially in the winter months, we're seeing an observed increase in the frost-free season length. So the frost-free season length is the last occurrence of 32 degrees Fahrenheit or freezing in the spring and the first occurrence in the fall. And that period in the Midwest has increased by about 9 days across that region. That also has impacts on our plant hardiness zone. So we've seen plant hardiness zone changes in Minnesota. This figure is showing on the left in 1990. And at that time, we had mostly zone 3 and zone 4. But by 2006, we actually had gained another zone, zone 5. So zone 3, zone 4, and zone 5. And those are based on some of those temperature extremes that plants can tolerate in that region. So we've gained an entire zone, especially in our southern area of Minnesota. And then that zone 3 really cold plant hardiness zone has kind of retreated more northward. Now shifting from temperature to precipitation. Precipitation and intense rainfall events are also increasing. So this figure is showing from left to right chronologically through time. On the right hand, you can see that between 1981 and 2010, so more recently, we've gained a lot more precipitation and a lot more intense rainfall. So that dark blue color is greater than 30 inches, and that's a lot of rainfall to get. Then talking about rainfall, some people define this as these extreme events as mega rain. That's one way to describe some of the events. And a mega rain is defined as at least 6 inches of rainfall over an area of at least 1,000 square miles in 24 hours or less. And I call this a lot of rain in a short amount of time. That's another way to think about it. So these mega rains were over 2 times more common in Minnesota from 2000 to 2022 than during the last about 3 decades of the 20th century. And of the 16 events that have occurred since 1973, 11 of those have been since 2000. And this image, you can actually look at it on DNR, their website. It's a 6-hour radar loop from the July 2016 extreme rainfall event. And what you'll see is this wall of red kind of come towards the Twin Cities, actually breaks up a little bit over the Twin Cities, and then goes on to hit Wisconsin. These are some images from the news that I've accumulated from some of those mega rains or really extreme rainfall events. And you can see there are a lot of consequences for infrastructure, for flooding, for ag, and in general, across Minnesota, we've seen a lot of that. And this, I don't know if it'll play, but we'll see. It's kind of funny. Yeah, so there's a water skier skiing on a flooded farm field. This is from last spring near Renville, Minnesota. And so that's pretty great for that water skier. That sounds really fun, but I bet that farmer was not so happy about the farm field being flooded. So, oops, there we go. So now I'll talk about some of the climate change projections for Minnesota. So this is some of the things that we may see in the future based on models of climate and greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And for this slide in particular, I've laid out some different codes for you to follow along when I'm talking about those projections, because there can be a lot of them. And so on the right-hand side, those are projections for temperature in red and orangish colors. RCP 8.5 is a high emission scenario. RCP 4.5 is more of an intermediate scenario. And what those RCPs refer to is representative concentration pathways, which is kind of a complicated way of describing the amount of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere, or greenhouse gas concentrations, and how they impact the heat that comes in and comes out of our atmosphere. On the left-hand side in blue, that's when I'll be talking about rainfall changes. And again, it's got that high and intermediate scenario for RCP 8.5 and 4.5. So overall, as far as temperature, this is under high emission scenario. We're seeing rising average temperatures in the Midwest, and that's projected to continue, especially in our northern latitudes. So you can see in dark red, those are some of the northern latitudes that are expected to see some of the greatest temperature differences between the past and out to mid-century. So this projection uses global climate models that assume emissions of heat trapping gases continue to rise. And when we're talking about these greenhouse gas emission scenarios, it's sometimes helpful to look at them visually and what that means over time. So we've got that high emission scenario, RCP 8.5, and the intermediate RCP 4.5 on this figure. And on the y-axis, we've got temperature change. So this is temperature change over time out to the end of the century. In orange, those lines that go kind of up and down with the orange arrow, that's observations in the past. So we've seen this gradual increase in temperature over time. And actually, it's harder to see on here, but since the 1970s, that's picked up a bit more. Then when we're looking out into the future, the bluish teal color, that's our intermediate scenario, and the red is our high scenario. So you can see out to mid-century, they overlap considerably. So a lot of those impacts and projections are fairly similar out to mid-century, and then they start to diverge a lot more as you go out further into time towards the end of the century. This figure is showing days per year warmer than 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So those are really hot days. And in Minnesota, that's pretty hot for us. We do get hot days, but above 90 degrees is pushing it a bit for us. On the left, kind of in more yellow, is historical temperatures, the days per year that are above 90 degrees. And then on the right, that's under our intermediate emissions scenario. So you can see, especially in southern Minnesota, we're gaining those 90-degree plus days. And then when we look at the high emission scenario, so that's the RCP 8.5, that's a lot more severe. So basically all across Minnesota, we're gaining quite a few 90 degrees and above days, with the exception of that little part along the North Shore, which has the lake cooling effect. Now, when we're talking on the other end of the spectrum, our really cold nights and our really cold temperatures, we're expected to see fewer sub-zero temperatures. So this figure is showing nights per year that are less than 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's under the intermediate scenario. So we can see historically on the left, we've had quite a few of those. I know Minnesotans sometimes complain about them, but they're actually really important, and we do like to see some of those per year. They help knock back a lot of pests and pathogens that affect our forests and our trees, as well as egg and other things. And they're also really important for if you're going out to harvest, we want those frozen ground conditions for forestry operations. And other things like recreation, like if you like ice fishing, that sort of thing. So when we look at the RCP 4.5 intermediate scenario on the right, we can see that especially in southern Minnesota, we're losing those sub-zero nights per year. And then in northern Minnesota, they're really retreating northwards as well. And then that's much more severe under the high emission scenario. So we're losing most of our nights per year, less than 0 degrees Fahrenheit out to the end of the century under that high emission scenario. And that's a big concern. And again, that has consequences for our winters. So average winter temperature in Minnesota is projected to be more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by the end of the century. And now we'll shift a little bit to talk about rainfall changes, because as I mentioned before, Minnesota's projected to get warmer and wetter, and that's kind of what we've been seeing up till now as well. This is projected change in spring precipitation. So a lot of that rainfall isn't actually projected to come evenly throughout the year. It's likely to happen in the spring or the tail end of our seasons. So this is under the high emission scenario. And in dark green, that's areas where we're seeing a pretty large change in spring precipitation. That's all throughout the Midwest and especially Minnesota. Those black lines, those hash marks, that's showing where it's actually statistically significant increases in spring precipitation as well. When we look at historically compared to the intermediate scenario and our high emission scenario, this is the average number of days per 100 years when daily rainfall exceeds 4 inches. So these are really, really rare, extreme intense rainfall events. And we can see from left to right, historical, intermediate, high emissions, those days are expected to increase, especially in southern Minnesota and southeastern Minnesota. So that's a lot of rain. And then when we're looking at days per year with more than 1 inch of precipitation, so a more moderate amount of precipitation, that's also projected to increase overall. So this is the high emission scenario showing, again, southern Minnesota, southeastern Minnesota, kind of up towards Duluth. These are areas we've already seen some flooding effects as well, but that's projected to increase in precipitation. But then what's important to remember is that that increase in precipitation isn't necessarily going to be even throughout the year. So it's not necessarily when rainfall is most needed. This figure that's just popped up on your screen with the orange is also under the high emission scenario, but it's for summer precipitation by the end of the century. And what we can see is actually in some parts of Minnesota, like southern Minnesota and southwestern Minnesota, we might actually lose some precipitation during the summer. So with that more intense rain projected to increase, that also comes with the possibility for more frequent and severe dry periods in between. So we can't discount the possibility for drought or severe impacts like that, especially when we might need rain the most. But that's less severe under our intermediate emission scenario. So what just popped up and replaced the high emission scenario is the summer precipitation for the lower emissions. And we can see that loss of rainfall during our summers is much less for southern Minnesota, that region. So there's still legal room to, interfere with some of these more severe impacts, depending on our adaptation and our mitigation strategies today. And then talking about those dry periods, this is the Palmer Drought Severity Index. So the Palmer Drought Severity Index, basically it includes those temperature effects and impacts on soil moisture and how that impacts vegetation, crops, things like that. And so this figure is from the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center. It's actually a cool animation. So if you go to that site for nasa.gov, you can watch it as it progresses throughout the century. But what we're seeing is more negative PDSI or palm drought severity indexes throughout most of the United States, and that includes Minnesota and the Midwest. So mild PDSI or -1 to -2, that's about where some of the native vegetation almost ceases to grow. And -2 to -3 is when the least tolerant species of the native plant community begin to die and be replaced by more drought-resistant species. Now I'm going to talk more about some of the climate change risks specific to Minnesota and our forests. So this figure, some of you might, or this image, some of you might recognize. It's the North Shore of Minnesota with Lake Superior in the background. And this is showing shifts in Minnesota's forested landscape. So on the far left, that's our current distribution. And then what I want to highlight here is that as we go from left to right into a lower or more intermediate scenario to a high emission scenario, one of the main impacts that we're seeing is a shift in our forests, especially that spruce fir or those more boreal types of forests in northern Minnesota. Under the current distribution, we have some spruce fir, that sort of boreal temperate boundary up there. And under the lower emission scenario, that's really retreating more to our arrowhead. And under high emission scenario, we could even see under this projection oak and hickory forest. So that's pretty wild to think about that up north along the North Shore, an oak hickory forest replacing our boreal forests. But what's really important to remember about this is it's not guaranteed. None of this is guaranteed to happen. The trajectory really does depend on our climate mitigation actions now and our adaptation actions that we take now. So there are lots of different ways that I'll talk about a little bit that we can help adapt our forest management and that we can help those trees cope with change. And then it also depends on if we can limit our emissions to intermediate or lower, that those impacts into the future will be much less severe. And another thing I like to highlight is that Minnesota actually has a lot of potential for climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So Minnesota is home to more peatlands than any other state besides Alaska, making our state a carbon sequestration powerhouse. So that's pretty cool. And peatlands can sequester large amounts of carbon. The caveat is that they can become a major source of greenhouse gas emissions if they're disturbed. So we really need to be careful how we manage our peatlands in the state of Minnesota so we can harness that potential to sequester carbon and make sure more of it's not getting out into the atmosphere. And this is something especially related to forestry because sometimes we are managing forests that are in peatlands or things like our black spruce and tamarack. And when we're looking at those forest soils and Minnesota's capacity to sequester carbon, a lot of it's in our forest soils, so about 71%, and those peatlands are really what's contributing a lot to that. So now talking a little bit more about adaptation in tree species and forestry specifically, a lot of my background is in experiments and research. So this is the before warmed experiment or boreal forests warming at an ecotone in danger. And there's one site in Cloquet and another site up in Ely in northern Minnesota. On the left-hand side, you can see some pictures. The top picture is showing the infrared heat lamps that they have over plots of seedlings. And actually underground, they have heating cables as well. So this has been going on for about 10 years, a little bit longer than that, simulating different levels of warming. And the species listed on here, there's 11 temperate and boreal species, and they actually added a couple more mid-experiment. But the goal for looking at these species was to represent a latitudinal band across Minnesota. So some of our more boreal species or cold adapted species compared to things like Acer rubrum that can deal with more of a variety of temperatures and are more extensive across our state. And so I got to look at some of this data as part of my PhD. And so that was really cool to look at about 10 years of shoot extension. So this is when the shoots are starting to extend and starting to grow on all of these different species. And this is a super complicated figure, and partly it's intended just because one of the takeaways is that it's largely species dependent. And there's a really awesome body of research by Claudia Naninga, who's in my advisor Rebecca Montgomery's lab, and she just defended as well. And she'll have her dissertation out, but it's showing a lot of those impacts of warming on phenology, or the yearly changes and yearly things like blooming, bud burst, yearly things that happen related to temperature and seasons. And a lot of her work is showing it's species dependent. But here, one of the main takeaways that we actually saw is that it's hard to see, but in the top two panels, that's ambient temperatures, when per year those species started extending their shoots. The middle is more of an intermediate level of warming, and then the last one's a bit higher. And what we saw is that the start of shoot extension, that began earlier in the year under higher warming, but that shoot extension also ended earlier in the year under higher warming. So overall, there was statistically no actual increase in the growing season. And that's something that was really a little bit surprising, because a lot of times we think, oh, well, we're having a, lower frost-free, or more frost-free period of time. Maybe, we're going to extend our growing season. That could help for carbon sequestration. And that's not always the case. There's other ways that trees grow too, besides just extending their shoots. So we can't say for sure, but it's important to keep in mind that a lot of that might be species dependent, and we can't count on a longer growing season for helping us adapt necessarily. And then another example that I really like to highlight is the adaptive silviculture for climate change experiment. So this is part of a national network across the US, and actually some sites now into Canada, that's looking at how to help adapt our forest management to cope with climate change. And it's got three basic theories that it uses in all of these installations. First is resistance. So that's helping improve a forest defenses against predicted changes or disturbance to maintain relatively unchanged conditions. So in the Chippewa National Forest, that's where our first installation was. And in that case, resistance looks like trying to maintain red pine, doing a little bit of thinning to help boost their defenses against climate change impacts. But it's not a big change from what we usually see. Then resilience is accommodating some change, but encouraging a return to a prior or desired reference condition following disturbance. So that's the idea of trying to bounce back from something. You get hit by maybe a drought and trying to bounce back. But it does allow for a little bit more flexibility than the resistance treatment. And at the Chippewa National Forest, at that Ask site, the way that looks is that actually across the landscape, there's more diversity. So that treatment has included things like skips and gaps, where there's a little bit higher and lower density of trees. It's also planted more of a variety of native tree species instead of just red pine. So it's kind of hedging bets against what might happen and the different impacts we might see. And then the last idea is this idea of transition. And that's to facilitate change and encourage ecosystems to adaptively respond to new or changing conditions. So that's really our more drastic strategy, looking into the future if we see more severe warming or severe impacts, and helping that forest transition into something that maybe plays a similar role ecologically, but it won't necessarily be the same as in the past. So Brian Pollock, who leads the Chippewa National Forest site, he has a cool interview where he describes this as not your grandparents' forest, but hopefully your grandchildren's. So thinking far ahead into the future, into preserving something that's ecologically functioning. And this could also include bringing in species from southern seed zones to try and help facilitate that migration. And it could also include things like assisted migration overall with species that aren't necessarily from that region, but are projected to do well. And it's also important to mention, it's not listed on here, but behind all of this is also the strategy of managing passively, so not necessarily intervening at all. And that's a strategy as well. So that's something to consider too amongst all of these. This is just 2 pictures showing those different sites. We've actually got 2 in Minnesota, which is pretty cool, and you can go check them out. The one I've been talking about is the Chippewa National Forest Cutfoot Experimental Forest Site. That's on Leech Lake Banded Ojibwe lands. It's 500 acres, north central Minnesota near Leech Lake and Lake Winnibigoshish. And it's the first installation of this adaptation experiment. The other one on the right, that's in the Mississippi National River area in the Crosby Farm Regional Park. And that's close to the Twin Cities. It's 549 acres. It's about a 10-minute drive from downtown St. Paul, and it's the largest natural park in the city. So that one's pretty cool. That one's a bit newer. And if you are at the Shade Tree Short Course this week, Leslie Brandt and some of the folks working on that gave a cool presentation on it. But you can go check it out in the Twin Cities if you're in the area. Same for the Chippewa National Forest. This is at the Chippewa National Forest. This is also where I did some of my PhD work. So you can see in the left, that's me and my sister. I put my family to work planting red pine seedlings. And we also there to look at some of the adaptive responses to rainfall reduction or variation in rainfall. We put these, they're called rainout shelters. They're basically greenhouse roofs that block a certain amount of rainfall. So that helps us simulate what if we do get a drought in this region, how are those different species going to respond? And we also installed this in our passively managed, so controls, kind of what if we don't do anything, what if we don't actively manage compared to the transitions on the bottom, those really heavily thinned treatments with more variety in the species assemblages there. And you can check this out. Like I said, I just finished up my PhD and this is finally publicly available. So this is Adaptation to Climate Change Impacts of Forest Management, Rainfall Reduction and Warming on Minnesota Tree Species. So you can look that up and dig into some of the other details if you'd like. But I'm super excited that it's all done and it's out there. So now I'll talk a little bit more about managing risks and looking to the future. So when it comes to climate change, we've committed to change. And what I mean by that is based on the emissions that have already occurred, we're kind of locked into a certain amount of change already. So our exposure to climate impacts is dependent upon how well we prevent further emissions and how well we manage the change that we're already projected to see and that we've started seeing. That comes with a focus on adaptation and climate risk management. So at MCAP, we focus a lot on adaptation. Adaptation comes in many forms and is needed across human and natural systems. We're responding to the imperative to adapt while we also seek to mitigate climate change. So this figure is showing kind of how mitigation and adaptation overlap. We need to prepare, so we need to adapt. We need to prevent further emissions, so we need to mitigate, and there's a lot of co-benefits when those overlap. And we can also think of climate risk as a function of our exposure. So our exposure to those likely changes, what kind of projections are we seeing in our area, plus our sensitivity. So those unique impacts, what are we specifically sensitive to? And that helps us figure out our adaptive capacity or our capacity to minimize harm and pivot. So we must also reduce our risks through adaptation. It can bring multiple benefits, improved egg productivity, innovation, health, food security, biodiversity, all these different things that are really important going forward. And long-term planning and accelerated implementation, particularly in this next decade, is really important to close adaptation gaps. So this next decade is really truly important, both for adaptation and for mitigation. This is kind of our window to make the most change. And so it's important that we're pushing forward with those actions as soon as we can. When we're looking at some of those sources of greenhouse gas emissions and where can we mitigate, This figure on the right is showing change in Minnesota's emissions by sector up to 2018. And we can see that some of our main emissions are coming from energy and ag. But we've also got things like industry waste on there. Transportation, electricity generation, and ag, forestry, land use, those have kind of gone down in their emissions since 2005. And other things like industrial emissions, residential and commercial have gone up a bit. Then when we're thinking about climate change, I pulled out some specific examples. So buildings cause more than 40% of US CO2 emissions, which was something kind of wild to me when I first learned it. But if you think about it, all the construction that goes into it, the maintenance, electricity, everything like that, that makes sense. And forests are responsible for 85% of all US carbon sinks. So that's pretty awesome. And folks who manage forests, folks who are in forestry, urban forestry have a lot of potential there. At the same time, forests also face climate stressors like heat waves and drought. And so that does reduce their ability to act as carbon sinks. So we really need to make sure we're mitigating that environmental stress, reducing sources of emissions, and helping our forests and ecosystems adapt to change so they can be successful at being carbon sinks and continue to be ecologically functioning. And I like to pull this up kind of towards the end when we're talking about adaptation, climate adaptation, and climate change in general. It's important to think about yourself as well and mental health. So there's a lot of impacts that we've seen on people's mental health in general when they're thinking about climate change, dealing with that, and kind of the weight of it. And that all ends up impacting your physical health, mental health, and community health. So it's all kind of connected. Some examples include climate fatigue, anxiety, grief, dread, even PTSD and shock when you've experienced some of those extreme events, let's say like a wildfire, a hurricane, and impacts on culture and cultural lifeways, despair, uncertainty. So this is a quote from Dr. Catherine Hayhouse. She's one of the leaders in climate change and currently a chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy. I used to begin my presentations by talking about temperature data, heat trapping gases, but now I begin most of my presentations in the same way by asking people, how do you feel about climate change? I get the same words everywhere: anxious, worried, frustrated, concerned, devastated, overwhelmed, etc. And so I like to encourage people to add to this list in a more positive vein, things like uplifted, encouraged, empowered. And part of my reason for saying that too is that I actually have a lot of hope for Minnesotans and their level of concern about climate change, and they're pushing for climate action. So 76% of Minnesotans are concerned about climate change. And 62% of Gen Zers, so our really young, hip, and cool folks, they're hopeful that society will do enough to reduce the most severe impacts of climate change. And that's really awesome to see because they're some of the folks who have been dealing with climate change since they were born and are facing some of those severe impacts. So they're hopeful. That makes me hopeful. And then action, 64% of Minnesotans think we should prepare for climate change by preserving and conserving Minnesota's grasslands, forests, and wetlands. So folks who are involved with forests, forest management, or even just planting trees in your yard, we have a lot of potential to be taking action, and Minnesotans really want us to do that. And then lastly, Minnesotans are concerned and want to see action. So 60% of all Minnesotans would like to see an increase in the use of wind, solar, and other renewable energy to power homes and businesses. So we want action in the forms of energy, and we want that to happen in powering our homes and at an individual level as well. And then 83% of all Minnesotans think local, state, and municipal governments are responsible for addressing climate change in the state. So that tells me that it's really important for folks to get out there and tell their governments that they want climate action and they want adaptation, they want mitigation, they want our government to be taking that responsibility very seriously. And I like to always end on a quote by our director, Dr. Heidi Roop. She says, together through research, experimentation, collaboration, and leadership, we can help ensure that Minnesota is ready for the impacts of climate change today and tomorrow. And she actually just came out with a book. I think she'll be having like a book opening event on the 28th of March. And this is her book, The Climate Action Handbook. It's a visual guide to 100 climate solutions for everyone. And it's not just visual, it also has some really great text. But one thing she really likes to emphasize is that even small actions can help move the dial on climate change. So moving away from, calculating a carbon footprint, which can still be helpful, but emphasizing that everyday actions, talking to your neighbors, planting trees, managing your forest, those sorts of things can help move the dial on climate change too, and are really important. This is our advisory board, so some of the folks who help advise MCAP or the U of M Climate Adaptation Partnership. And then we also have a webinar next week, next Tuesday at noon with Meredith Cornett, Sachi Graver, and Aaron Mackey from the Nature Conservancy, talking about the value of natural climate solutions in Minnesota. So you might be interested in that. Some of the references, and thank you very much.
Jamie, I think we'll keep you on, keep your slides up for right now, and we'll answer some questions from your slide set in case you have to go back to them. Okay.
Sounds good.
So Lauren, why don't you go ahead and start with your Q&As and the questions in the Q&A, and then I will look at the chat and see how that's coming.
Okay, there's only 2 in the Q&A so far. The first one is, we are adding to the existing forest on our property in Washington County and trying to get ahead of climate change by planting some trees more common in Zone 5, including some sycamore trees. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations for planting locations, strategies to help those trees survive while we are still seeing Zone 4 conditions?
Oh, that's a great question. And that is awesome that you guys are adding some climate adapted trees to your existing forest. I'll say that actually Gary Wyatt and the forestry team are working on a really cool list of climate adapted trees. So that's awesome. And that should be coming out sometime soon. So look for that. As far as helping to manage for those trees now before they necessarily fully move into another zone, I would say making sure that you're paying attention to the things like their soil requirements, how much watering that they need. You might need to kind of baby them a little bit, I would say. But the other thing that I would say is actually at that adaptive silviculture for climate change experiment, one thing that we've been seeing is some of those species that are from a little bit farther south have been surviving and doing relatively well, which is pretty cool. A little bit concerning, but also encouraging that those have been successful. So it does hint to me that some of those conditions are sort of shifting to being okay. If you're planting really small seedlings, yeah, make sure you're babying them. That's what I did when I planted mine. I put up deer netting, all that sort of thing to kind of protect them. But yeah, that's awesome.
Lauren, you want to go ahead with the next question?
Yep. I am a maple syrup producer. My climate change concern is as much near term as it is long term. Very concerned about what I see as the accelerated amount of storm and wind damage to my sugar bush. Does research support my experience and concerns? What do you see as the future of Minnesota's abundant sugar maple stands?
Yeah. So sugar maple, if you look up sugar maple in the climate change tree atlas, if you Google that, that's a really awesome resource where you can pull up a map of the US and take a look at how the current habitat is changing and the future habitat is changing. In my own studies, actually, sugar maple is doing okay, but as we see those changes to our winters and to our springs, that's a little bit concerning there. The other part of the question was looking at storms and wind, that sort of thing. And we do actually have on the climate change downscaled data for Minnesota, that tool that's coming out. We will be trying to incorporate wind as well. That's something that I'm not as familiar with any projections for wind, except that we are likely to see more extreme events. So the storms that we've had might get more intense. So that's something to keep in mind. And yeah, check out that tool when it comes out, and I can also dig into some more resources on wind if you'd like. And so feel free to reach out to me.
Okay, I do have 4 more questions in Q&A. Gary, did you want to start in on chat and switch off?
Why don't you go ahead and finish the question Q&A, and then I'll start chat after you're done.
Sounds good. Next question, is there collaborative work being done to help with getting the message to non-academia lay populations?
Yeah, and I also see on the questions too, asking about when Gary's list will be out, and that kind of relates to this question. So that first list will, most of that will be for lay people, for the general audience, and so that's really great. That adaptive silviculture for climate change experiment, the installation in Minnesota, or in St. Paul, in the Twin Cities area in particular, they actually have a lot of tours, and they also encourage folks to get out and volunteer with them. And I think that there's a lot of opportunities for the general public to learn more about those species and what's going on as far as adaptation there. But I'd also say pay attention to, like extension services, stuff like that. We're also going to hopefully be coming out with something called a community climate leaders program through MCAP, so through my team, that will help provide some of that guidance to individuals, and that they can take back to their communities.
Okay, next question. Not sure if we answered this one yet. Can you let us know when, where Gary's list of trees for the future will be out?
Yeah, definitely, Gary. You might be able to answer that one a bit better, but I think there's definitely plans to get the word out for that.
Right. It's not necessarily my list, but certainly the forestry team, and Jamie's a part of that team. Certainly, we're hoping to do the metro area first and have that released in April, we're hoping. And then obviously other regions of the state with the DNR regions following the same regions as the DNR has outlined in their maps around the state for biomes and so forth. And then have an individual listing for each region that we have in the state of Minnesota this summer, hopefully.
Okay, and then what is a good reference source for propagating / seeding starting native trees in our region?
Yeah, so first off, I'd probably say connecting with a local forester in your region would be awesome, because I'm sure that they can provide a lot more detail and take a look at your lands and your forests specifically. So they'd be really awesome, and they can also connect you to seed sources that they might recommend. I've usually gone through the state nursery through the DNR for getting seedlings started, but those are just the recommendations off of the top of my head. Also, taking a look at that climate change tree atlas, that's something that's always been really useful to me, because you can dig into, I think they've got at least 150 different species, so checking that out.
Okay, 2 more questions so far in the Q&A. This one is, we live in the sand plains of Anoka and have quite a few old oak trees out back. We live in the inner city and are having quite a few of them dying off. Is there anything we can do to help them? We also have a boulevard of blaze orange maples. We are starting to have more wind damage. Anything you can recommend to help? We do regular tree trimming now.
Yeah, so for those oaks, there was actually a really cool talk on Thursday at the Shade Tree short course about oak health. And so there's a lot of different things that can impact oak health. One of the big concerns is oak wilt. So bringing someone out to get an idea of what might be going on there can be really helpful, because the strategies to deal with that is a little bit different. But yeah, looking out for things like oak wilt that can spread really easily from tree to tree and can be pretty dramatic. There's also a bunch of other oak-related tree diseases that aren't quite as serious. But a lot of those happen if you've had damage to your oak tree from other things. So from those storms, that could be one thing that's opening up wounds where some of those diseases can get in and impact them. Or if you've also been having things like drought, if you've had really dry conditions, so on a sand plain, that might be susceptible to that. So making sure you're keeping those trees under as little stress as possible, because that helps them fight back against any sort of dieback or any sort of disease that they might be facing. Gary might have some great suggestions about this too. And then for wind, I know Gary has worked with things like windbreaks as well. That might be something to consider as well for your trees that are really susceptible to wind damage. But then also for maples as well, making sure that they are kind of getting all the things that they need to fight back that stress. And so, yeah, maybe buffering them a little bit, but also maples can be susceptible to some different diseases as well. So trying to keep them less stressed.
Another comment on that question, Jamie, might be to hire a certified arborist to come out to your place.
Yeah.
You haven't had one visit your landscape there, and then determine what's going on with your trees and if there's any corrections that need to be made. Yep.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, Gary. They can do some awesome work, and they're really good at diagnosing kind of what's going on. Yeah, and I also noticed you mentioned pruning, and they are really great at that too. So even just consulting with them could be good to make sure that pruning is happening at a good time.
Okay, next question. Is that Mississippi/St. Paul site along the river bottom?
Yeah, it actually is. So it's along a floodplain forest, so which is pretty unique. And that means they've got some really interesting species. Another thing that's interesting about it is that ash trees that have been impacted by emerald ash borer. There's a lot of those along floodplains because they tend to do well in wet conditions. So that's a situation where they're looking at, what are some alternatives to those more wet conditions.
Okay, and then we still see intense cold some days. Will that stymie moving tree species northward?
Yeah, so we still do, as Minnesotans know pretty well, it still gets pretty cold here. I don't think that will necessarily stymie things moving forward. Part of the impact of those days is not just them occurring, but the number of days that they occur and how long that cold spell lasts. So I don't think so. But on the other hand, trees don't move very quickly on their own. So yeah, helping them move along by thinking carefully about what you're planting is one way to deal with that as well. Because yeah, when trees are seedlings, that's when they're some of the most sensitive as well.
Awesome. Well, that is all the Q&A. Gary, are there questions in the chat?
Sorry, I was muted. I was talking there.
That's okay.
I'm sorry. Kathy asked the question. So is planting an apple orchard, we need to plant on the coldest side of the land? I would say so right now, just to quickly answer that question. Christina asks, let's see, looks like we're going to need to switch to crops that do most of their growing in the spring and seed and either by air or by fall. And yeah, that's maybe a comment, but yeah, hopefully we can adapt. Actually, I have a farmer next to me in Whatwan County that has pattern tile lines underneath the soil, and then obviously put up a sprinkler irrigation system on top of the soil. So, he's actually looking at protection of risk on both extremes. Tyler asks, what do these projections of species shifts, precipitation patterns and increased temperatures suggest about changes to fire dynamics in forests across the state? Frequency, severity, does this suggest a need for changing how we manage forest and fuel loads, working with fire versus against it?
Yeah, so looking at fire, that's really exciting. I think in general, incorporating fire will be really key and useful. So a lot of our Native nations have been leading those sorts of efforts of bringing fire back onto the landscape. Definitely as we have more extremes, things like extreme hot days or dry periods, that, that might be some concern, and also how wet it might be. So you kind of need ideal conditions for doing those prescribed burns. But I do think that'll be exciting. When I think about the transition treatment in the Chippewa National Forest, for example, that seems like a great example where fire would be really useful, because you're trying to maintain a lower stand density, and so using that fire to come through and knock back some of the we've got a lot of hazel and raspberry that takes over, so I think that would be really key. And so yeah, I'm glad to hear you asking about fire.
Vanessa, congratulate you on defending your dissertation. You need to be proud of your work. So obviously a lot of people applaud that.
Thank you so much.
Margaret's saying, how is the Climate Adaptation Partnership working with our current legislature?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So that's one of the sectors that we're trying to make sure we're providing resources to. So making sure that we're providing some of the things I talked about are climate change impacts in Minnesota, as well as the projections. So we'll be having trainings for that climate change Minnesota-based data tool for legislatures as well, kind of tailored to that. But also our director, Heidi Roop, is really involved with talking to local government and our legislature. She's testified in front of the legislature a few times in actually the past couple weeks. So I think that's really awesome. And as we keep kind of building capacity, we're hoping to be one of those resources that folks can come to. And, if you're working in the legislature, if you're a politician, you can get a really accurate idea of our climate situation here in Minnesota.
Kathy asked about solar. So is there a projected model of how increasing solar will affect climate change?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know of one, but I can dig into some of those. But yeah, that's a great question.
Okay. Can you share the webinar info again? I wonder if that's the webinar that you mentioned next week.
I think so. I just popped it in the chat. I'll pop it in one more time in case anyone missed it. And it will be recorded. So they're all recorded, and they'll be put onto the MCAP YouTube page afterwards. So if you miss it, no problem.
Excellent presentation. We will release the tree list as fast as we can. Obviously, it's not my tree list, it's our forestry team list, and Jamie's part of the team, certainly. But we're hoping to do the Metro first and get that done in April. There's the link that Mike submitted, I think, from the for the webinar next Tuesday in the chat. And then let's see, can you figure out how to copy that link? Oh, out of chat. Can you ask Jamie to switch back to that slide? Can you go back to that slide?
Yes, definitely.
And I think, oh gosh, do we have?
There we go.
There's the link. Sonia's got a link there. Thank you. Let's see.
Oh yeah, it doesn't have the link there, but I can click on it on my screen, which is kind of cheating. So it's climate.uofm.edu. And if you go to the events and then scroll down to webinars, it'll pop up.
And the Tuesday weenie will be recorded, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
And I think we're going to have to close there. I've got, there's lots of messages here. Congratulations. Mostly congratulations and good job. We'll have to close. Let's work on closing. Today's webinar.
I'm just popping in my email into the chat. So if you do have other questions, feel free to follow up with me or with MCAP. Oh, Diane Bias-Mosel, that's my aunt. I just saw.
Yeah, so there's Jamie's email, and could you stop sharing now?
Oh,
and I will start.
Yes.
And let's see. Let me get back to this on the screen here. Got a few slides to show you, and then we'll keep on going here. Thank you, Jamie, for a wonderful presentation today on climate adaptation. And we do have a very good team on the St. Paul campus regarding the Minnesota Climate Adaptation Partnership. And if you want to email Jamie any of your questions, please do. Whoops. There is a link again that Jamie showed earlier. If you want to become more active in that climate group, there's a Minnesota or minclimate@umn.edu email that you can contact that group and be a part of that. We do have some more Fridays with a Forester coming up, and we want to allow you to participate in that. Obviously, if you have a person that hasn't registered for that, registration is just z.umn.edu/Fridays 2023, and you can register for those. And actually, we do have the recordings on Fridays. When you leave today's Zoom, there'll be an evaluation. If you could do a quick evaluation, that we'd appreciate that. And then if you want to look at the recording posting recordings on our Fridays website at z.umn.edu/Fridays. And if you're not a member of the My Minnesota Woods email, you can access it through there as well. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to another Fridays with a Forester. Thank you, Jamie, so much.
Oh, thank you, Gary. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Great job.